There's been a few changes to WhatsApp, and as a result of that, many people have questioned whether or not it's the best what kind of way to engage with people. And in this episode, we're going to cover effectively just that. Should you keep using WhatsApp to use communications within your groups, your teams, your networks, or should you be thinking about something else? We're going to take a look at that right now. If you find this useful, leave us a like down below and let us know you like this content. And Andy, tell us more.
Yeah, so there's been a big story at the beginning of the year in the media about WhatsApp and changes to WhatsApp's privacy policy. So like many users, at some point in early January, I logged into WhatsApp and was faced with a notification saying agree to the new privacy policy or stop using WhatsApp. And I suppose like many people do, what I did was I just agreed to the new privacy policy and I continued to use WhatsApp. However, I did then see lots of references to this in the media. Initially, lots of the references were, I think, about what people were worried might have happened or that they might have signed up to or for. And that might have been a little bit different to what was actually happening. So I think it's important that we talk about what people were worried about and then also dig a little bit deeper and think about what actually happened and what the changes actually were. And then I think it's probably appropriate, Gandhi, for us to have a conversation about what that means to us, various alternatives and so forth. So that's how I see the conversation panning out today. How about you?
Absolutely agree. So I think we're going to cover kind of what the changes are to WhatsApp and stuff. We're going to go through, I think, some of the more commercial alternatives that people may have heard of, and particularly in a lot of the groups may have seen about, and then focus a little bit more deeper in terms of the medical-based stuff that is more relevant, I guess, to us as clinicians, but also relevant to many of our listeners as well. So I guess the first question is, what exactly was the change? Can you talk us through it, Andy?
Well, I want to say what people were worried about. So, or what I was instantly worried about, and what seemed to explode in the media was the notion that WhatsApp are going to be able to see what is inside your messages, and this idea that WhatsApp might share that with Facebook, and that Facebook will profile you in more detail and will advertise all sorts of stuff based on what you thought were private conversations, and that seems to be what some people thought was going on Twitter. But if you dive a little bit deeper, and I think if we just share the screen, just so we can direct people to some useful articles. So just starting with the Independent. The Independent did a good job of explaining what was actually happening with the changes, but actually the best place, if you trust what they say, I'm sure we do, then WhatsApp actually quickly created a page in their FAQ section to address these changes and talk about what they actually mean. So these changes were put in place because WhatsApp is expanding its offer to businesses, and they're making a kind of customer to business chat product line platform available so that businesses can engage with people on WhatsApp in a meaningful way. And what will happen when customers engage with businesses is that obviously businesses will see the content of those conversations, and actually businesses will have the opportunity and the right to retain those communications that they're having with customers, which might actually be important for complaints or customer service purposes, that they will perhaps understandably retain or have the ability to retain that data from those communications. So that would no longer be completely private, and also that they would have access to some of the metadata around those communications. So what metadata is data about data. So if I were to send you a message, Gandhi, you'd get the message, but actually attached with that might be information about the location that the message was sent from, if I've given consent for that to come, what time it was sent, perhaps that it is a message between the two of us, all of these sorts of things, and they would be able to see that, and that might have some value for marketing purposes. So that's what actually happened. And actually, because these businesses would have that data, it's not shared directly with Facebook, but these businesses may choose to use that to direct their Facebook marketing. So some of that information might end up being used on Facebook to show you advertisements for things that you've been communicating with a business about potentially. So that was really what was going on. But it led to quite a lot of hoo-ha in the media. So anything to add, Gandhi, about the actual
Yeah, I think a lot of this is also viewed with the prospect that at the end of the day, Facebook owns WhatsApp. It also owns Instagram, so three big platforms. And there has long been held the view that at some point Facebook wants to amalgamate the messaging capabilities between all three of those platforms, because for their perspective, it massively improves obviously the costings, as well as the information that they can, in a sense, derive from the platform itself, and therefore lead to better advertising, which is obviously how all three of those platforms make their money. Although not really WhatsApp, because it doesn't have an
Well,
advertising
how does
function.
WhatsApp make money? I'm not sure it does. So I think that's part of the agenda here.
True.
Do continue, Gandhi.
But yeah, including businesses within that has been one of the expansion that WhatsApp has done lately, and that's potentially a mechanism for monetizing WhatsApp a bit more effectively. And there's even talks about being able to set up shops on WhatsApp from a business perspective. So I have a WhatsApp business account for EGP Learning that we use for supporting our conferences and things, and it gives me the options of doing some extra things that your personal WhatsApp doesn't allow you to do. Fair enough. But yeah, this caused a lot of commotion at the time, and a lot of people got quite worried about it. What does this mean? How is this going to affect what I do? Does this mean that my chat with my uncle Jenny or whatever can now be shared with everybody on Facebook? And be clear that that's not the case. And I guess to try and help understand, we're going to go a little bit into the kind of technology and understand the security and that kind of things, and compare that to against two of the other platforms that particularly been mentioned when people thought about changing off WhatsApp. So specifically looking at Signal and Telegram. So where should we start, Andy?
Shall we stop? There was a good comparison table on one of the articles, Gandhi, that you'd forwarded to me, which I think is a useful visual place to start. Although really we're looking at feature sets, but if people are thinking about moving from one app to another, that's an important consideration. I think will it do what you want it to? Interestingly, a lot of the competitors seem to be fairly feature rich compared with WhatsApp. So I think that's an interesting consideration. I'm more interested in the security though, Gandhi, the security and the privacy issues. Where do you want to go?
So I think if we just focus a little bit more on the features first of all, so a couple of ones I did want to highlight. So one that I know many people get frustrated with is the group limit on WhatsApp in terms of being 256. Now, some people out there are probably thinking, why on earth is that an issue? Because having a group of 256 people is a lot anyway. However, both you and I are part of things like PCN, clinical directors chat groups, and a lot of those, there's now actually about 4 or 5 groups for various different reasons. And that's just because they can't fit us all in one group, which is slightly annoying, because then you kind of have an element of FOMO because there's 3 other groups, and actually is one of them more engaging or relevant to what you're trying to talk about, or is there information there that, there's that element of things. So if WhatsApp had a larger group capacity, I actually think that'd be nicer, which obviously Signal has by going up to 1,000. And Telegram, I think there's just gone overboard. I mean, 200,000 people in a chat group. That's just crazy. But it's an interesting feature to have, I guess.
Yeah, I suppose it goes. I mean, there's a certain number of people in an active chat that is unmanageable. But I know there's a lot of sort of broadcast style groups around on Facebook.
True.
Where actually only the administrators post and other people don't. And I know that's used a lot in WhatsApp. So if that's your objective, then you might be better within a different app like Signal or even Telegram, really.
And I guess the other feature quite a few of the platforms are now looking at is what's called self-destructing messages. So messages that you can post and then they kind of disappear after whatever length of time that you specify. And that can be useful for security purposes or sharing timely information. So, for example, if you've got using our world examples, if you have to submit a return for one of the DESs or LESs and you've only got to do it by Monday, well, it'd be nice to only have that message within the group until Monday, and then after that, it self-destructs. So then people aren't caught out and trying to do something that they don't need to do now or whatever. I can see some benefit for that, as well as I guess there's other reasons. But some other fun features are also quite nice to know about. So, things like GIFs and video sharing and that kind of stuff, they are different depending on the platforms. It does seem to me Telegram's more like a Facebook group style. When you go through all the different features, it could, you could almost translocate a Facebook group to a Telegram group almost, and particularly the polls feature seems nice. And I do kind of wish that was somewhere in WhatsApp to a degree for certain groups, but it's not the be all end all, is it?
Yeah, and also it's interesting because you can edit a message after it's been sent as well, which I think
Mhm.
is potentially problematic for the integrity of the
Yeah.
chronology of a debate or discussion. If you can change history,
Mhm.
that's quite a problematic feature, but perhaps less problematic if you're using for social purposes. But in a
True.
workplace, that might be problematic rather than being a feature for some people.
Mhm.
Um, so so again, I suppose a lot of people might have been sort of shook up by this news story around WhatsApp privacy. So I
Mhm.
think my thinking was, oh gosh, this sounds like it might be problematic. Oh, thank goodness, if I don't use the business to customer communications channel, I'm not affected.
Mhm.
However, does this represent a direction of travel
Mhm.
from the owner company Facebook towards this integration of WhatsApp into the Facebook ecosystem? I think their objective is to probably create something like WeChat, which is quite popular in China and is it's sort of their answer to WhatsApp, really. But you can also it's like WhatsApp with Amazon and YouTube and
Mhm.
shopping, other shopping outlets, kind of all roll into one. Peer-to-peer payments, you can pay other people, and
Mhm.
I do wonder if that's Facebook's ultimate objective. So I'm thinking, do I still want to be on this train that
Mhm.
might be heading in that direction, even if that's not where it's gone right now? What are my alternatives? And we've
Okay.
started to look at some of the features, but my concerns are around privacy,
Security. Yeah.
security.
So if we have a look at that, then so we've got this other article that's by Bbomb that is really good. Actually, it sets out the various different aspects of the different apps. So particularly looking at WhatsApp, Telegram, and Signal, and it talks through things like security, ownership, various different things. And I guess the thing to know about WhatsApp, so WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted. So what that means is that if I send you a message, the information that I've sent from my device through to WhatsApp servers and then downloads to your device is encrypted. So WhatsApp cannot see the content of the message. That's what end-to-end encryption means. And one of the nice things about this is it is open source end-to-end encryption. So WhatsApp actually use algorithms and keys and all that kind of stuff that anybody could go in and inspect to check the level of security and how robust they are, which is actually always that's considered to be the best way of doing it, because it also means, well, people might be thinking, well, that means anybody could look at the keys and decrypt it. Well, they can't, but they can check the security of those keys, and therefore it's validated and you're thought to be quite more secure by doing it that way. And interestingly, it's the same platform that Signal use, which Signal is probably considered the most secure out of all the various different messaging platforms around. So they actually use the same platform. I think it's called the Whisper platform or something like that. I can't quite remember the name.
Open Whisper Systems,
That's the one.
I believe they call it. Yeah.
The difference is that WhatsApp doesn't encrypt the metadata of the messages. So it doesn't encrypt the contact names in particular. It doesn't encrypt I guess potentially the timing of the message being sent. So whilst the content's encrypted, the package of the message is not necessarily encrypted, and therefore that potentially could be shared with Facebook, etc., as we mentioned earlier. And that's the difference between, I think, WhatsApp and Signal, whereas
Mm.
with Signal, everything's encrypted.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there. And just sort of touching on, because I think the ownership is potentially quite important. I think
Mm-hmm.
because so WhatsApp wasn't always owned by Facebook. It was founded by a chap. I think his name is later in this article, or he was one of the co-founders. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the key features that really got WhatsApp to have quite widespread adoption was this end-to-end encryption, because that was something fairly new. That particularly on Android devices, you couldn't, achieve that level of security, and that's really why it took off. And then Facebook bought it. They didn't really change any of these fundamentals for a long time, but they now look like they're beginning to soften some of these privacy features.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've touched on before, you just have to think about the objectives of these companies. Facebook needs to make some return on its investment in WhatsApp, and Facebook's business model is about selling advertising, and that needs data in order to
Mm-hmm.
deliver that. They could offer a paid version of WhatsApp or whatever, but that really doesn't have any synergy with the rest of their business model. So I think it's a legitimate concern that WhatsApp's security and privacy might soften slowly over time. Compare that with Signal. Now, this chap who maybe we can link to his name. I think it's called Brian something. One of the co-founders. So he's one of the founders of Signal. So he worked at WhatsApp. WhatsApp was acquired by Facebook, and then he left because he had concerns about the direction that they might take the business in, and founded Signal as part of the Signal Cooperative.
Something like that, yeah.
It's basically owned by a coalition of people. Ooh, looking to see if it's there. I can't land on it in the article, but anyway, but it's not owned by a for-profit company. It's owned by Foundation, Signal Foundation, and they maintain the app with the objective of providing the best secure and private app, and that's their objective. So I think you know where you stand with Signal. So just contrasting the ownership. I think we haven't really talked too much about Telegram, Gandhi, and so that perhaps sits somewhere in the middle with some of its own peculiarities or features.
Yeah, so I think Telegram will use a different model. So whilst they use end-to-end encryption, it's not open source. They've got their own proprietary form of end-to-end encryption. So, I mean, some people may say, well, is that more secure because they're the only ones that have the keys that can unlock the encryption? It's not available online or anything like that. Again, that's not exactly how open source works. It just means that people can inspect it. So there is that view that because Telegram is not open source, could they potentially look at the information because they've got the keys that unlock the encryption? Possible. Kind of go against the company's ethos, I would imagine, but it's a possibility because no one can go in and check the level of security of that encryption that they use. So there is that difference that Telegram has compared to Signal versus WhatsApp and things. Although I would say Telegram probably is more feature rich than Signal, and I guess that's the way I would rank it. WhatsApp is what most people are known and used to. Feature wise, it's very good. I think Telegram's probably a bit better, and Signal's probably got the least feature level content. But in contrast, Signal's the most secure for privacy and security. Telegram's somewhere in the middle, and then you've got WhatsApp, which is probably considered to some degrees the least secure, but is still pretty secure. You kind of have to know what you're doing to break it, to be honest.
I think another thing to note, if you do download Telegram, is that end-to-end encryption isn't activated as the default setting, and you have to activate that sort of secret, secure messaging feature.
That seems a bit of a weird reason to do that, to be honest. I mean, why you wouldn't switch that on automatically for everybody and have as an opt-out rather than opt-in is a bit weird, to be honest.
Yeah, it seems to me like it's a kind of essential feature that people would look for. So it's interesting that they don't activate that as the default setting. But, but that's interesting. So the other thing, Gandhi, I just want an elephant in the room is I'm going to ask you the question. So like me, you're probably concerned about the direction of travel with WhatsApp. So presumably you've deleted WhatsApp from your phone. You're now using Signal to communicate with all of your various contacts and people you communicate with, I suppose.
No.
So
why? I'm afraid.
So why not? Why are you still on? Why are you still on WhatsApp?
So it's something called the network effect, isn't it, Andy? It's the simple fact that everybody I know is on WhatsApp, and everybody I need or want to communicate with uses WhatsApp. This is the challenge, and for me to try and communicate through them with a different platform, I need them to be on the other platform for me to do that.
Absolutely, it's difficult, and we've just gone through a real period of adoption of these sorts of technologies, haven't we? We've gone through COVID. We've all been trying to communicate not in person and had the need to communicate with each other in a more real time and more urgent fashion. So there are so many new WhatsApp groups and just the general acceptance that people will use WhatsApp now for family and some professional groups, that it just feels like it would be very difficult to dislodge that. However, coming over the horizon is potentially another entrant that we've not talked about so far.
So I think if we were talking about our day job, obviously within the healthcare profession and things across the UK, all healthcare professionals now actually have access to a different platform which has interesting levels of security and access, and that's MS Teams. So is it that for our work-based stuff, which obviously we are slightly more concerned about from the security elements of things, is that the alternative that we need to consider? Or do we need to consider other platforms as well? And that's what we're going to now talk about. So MS Teams is the big one. Shall we have a quick look at it, Andy?
Yeah, we'll bring up the, hang on. So MS Teams. So the thing I would say is, so the question that that one might pose is, WhatsApp has such a huge network effect. You know, how can that possibly be dislodged? And actually, I think there's a potential here, because what someone could do is make it free to use for all of the NHS, and also say that you can only communicate certain types of information, such as patient-sensitive information, using that platform. And that's actually one way that you might dislodge something like WhatsApp from that particular use case within the NHS. And I think that that's sort of happening again for certain use cases, and possibly that might grow and cover other use cases and types of communication. So I think that's important. You know, these things seem insurmountable until they're not.
True. And you're right, we may see that happen with MS Teams, because with the network effect of everyone at least having access to it, whether they use it to the same degree or not is a separate part, I think. But having access to MS Teams is something that all people working with the NHS have. It has a different type of security, so it's not end-to-end encrypted. It uses, and I've forgotten the term, but it has encryption at rest and in transit. And that's basically because what you do with MS Teams is you dial into the Microsoft servers to access the information. It's not actually held on your device. It's your app or your interface that you have with it dials in to the servers, and then you can access the information from there. So it's to do with things like e-discovery and that kind of stuff. So it works slightly differently, but thought to be very secure, because you need the right kind of keys and concepts. And Microsoft use things like two-factor authentication to make sure it's the right person that's going in. So that's like the text message stuff that many of you probably seen when you sign in. It sends you a text message to confirm you're you, and then you have to put that in. So that's really positive. The slight frustration I've got with Teams is the fact that I can't create my own team using the NHS login. And it's a really small thing, but it's a usability factor that massively impacts how I can engage with people. Less of a problem with the chatting, but it's still an annoyance, to be honest. So yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's a good option. I've been quite impressed using Teams, actually. And we've talked a lot about Teams, haven't we? But it sort of bundles in a little bit of file storage that people might have alternatively used Dropbox or Google Drive for. There's collaborative document editing using Office 365, which is part of the Microsoft NHS sort of package or offer. So it does, and then obviously there's chat, which is like WhatsApp. So and video consulting, which is like Zoom. So actually it bundles all of these together. So I've been quite impressed with my experience with Teams. There were some initial teething problems where the technical quality of some of the video meetings weren't great, but that seems to have improved. So Teams, I think that's a credible player to unseat WhatsApp within the NHS potentially. But there are other options, aren't there, Gandhi? So some kind of plucky upstarts, I think I'll call them. And I don't have much experience with these apps myself, but I think we've had contact through EGP Learning with a number of them. So
So we've covered the first one before, Silo. So we talked about this in one of our earlier podcasts. I think it was way back when we actually started podcasting. Can you remember that far back, Andy?
Yeah, was it 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah.
Three years ago.
So we talked about Silo back then, and I've always been quite impressed with Silo. So Silo is probably the closest thing I would imagine you can get to having a WhatsApp for healthcare professionals that looks like WhatsApp. And it kind of does everything that WhatsApp sort of does, but it's secure enough that you can actually share patient data. And what I like about Silo in particular, so it uses your nhs.net login, so to authenticate that you're you. It uses elements of two-factor authentication to prove that as well. And it does allow you to discuss cases as well. They state, that their security level is to the point where they feel that's satisfactory. And also it's got a nice little web interface as well. So one of the things I really miss from my WhatsApp is being able to use the web interface at work, because work have blocked it. Whereas Silo is a different type of packaging, so you can actually use that. And it finds people in other NHS organizations, so you know that you're speaking to the right person. So I could potentially message one of my secondary care colleagues in the local hospital if they're on Silo and say, I'm trying to contact you about this patient. Can we discuss how to deal with things, and use that as an alternative mechanism rather than having to go through letters or other kind of things, if the system was so inclined to let me do that.
So good. Yeah, it's been around for a while, hasn't it? It looks like, I'm just looking at trusted, renowned institutions across Europe. So it looks like a number of organisations have at least endorsed it, if not kind of implemented it across their sites. This is the sort of thing I can see working really well, both in primary care, but also in secondary care, where it's important that people, often within the same hospital building, can communicate more effectively and rapidly about patients and exchange information. So it's the sort of thing I can see a hospital trust kind of going in for, and kind of just making people use it. So providing that network effect. I think it's up against some stiff competition from Teams now, though, given the national funding model that Teams has had. Next up is Medic Bleep, Gandhi.
Yeah, so Medic Bleep is a similar sort of platform. So we spoke to Sandeep, who's the kind of CEO of Medic Bleep, a while back again on our podcast. I think that was about 2 years ago. And it works fairly similarly. What I do think is slightly different for Medic Bleep. Medic Bleep seems to have a little bit more focus on primary care use in comparison. So it can be used by community teams, in my personal view, a bit better than Silo. However, the downside to Medic Bleep is you can't actually use it unless your area has signed up to it. So unlike Silo, which you can download onto your phone and start using potentially, even though nobody's actually in your area using it, you can still message other people outside of your local area. Medic Bleep, you kind of have to have your local area already agreeing to use it to then access it more effectively, because if you don't have that organizational use, it doesn't work as effectively. So it's harder to kind of try before you buy, although clearly they've got demos and the option to do that if you so wanted to. But you have to go through the company directly rather than just trying to download it off the App Store kind of thing.
Interesting option. And Pando is the final one. Do you want to talk me through Pando, Gandhi? I'm not familiar.
Yeah, so Pando's quite a good combination, I think, of the two. I think the reason why I like Pando is it's got a really good interface. I do see Pando much more as the secondary care focused version out of these. It allows you to have task lists and clinic lists and that kind of thing, which very much, from my perspective, seems to be more aligned with secondary care way of working. Because, to be honest, in primary care, if I was to do that, that wouldn't help me as effectively because it's not on my clinical system and there's no integration with things like System 1 and EMIS and stuff. So it kind of makes it less effective. But I could see the benefit of having it as a messaging system where you can discuss patients. And to be honest, if Teams hadn't come along, maybe I would have considered it for that reason as well. But interesting to see how it's being developed, but definitely good for, I think, secondary care use from my perspective.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting space to watch, really, because one thesis about what might happen going forwards is that MS Teams is just going to take over, and in the UK at least, there might be much less space for these apps to exist. Although they are pretty innovative, and I'm sure the feature set is better and more agile, and they can perhaps offer better local customization for NHS trusts and CCGs. So they might have a place in the future. But I'm really interested to see what happens over the next few years. But it was an interesting play by Microsoft to kind of charge into this space and almost take over the whole thing. And I think that was catalyzed by COVID-19, obviously. But it'd just be interested to see what it does to this kind of ecosystem of smaller apps that was quietly developing and gaining traction. Fascinating.
And I think you're right. I think the option for these other companies to personalize that use case for their local areas is something that is potentially quite attractive. So, you could have a set, I guess, interface for the MedReg on call, and then that can be transferred across. And does that mean then you can possibly replace the bleep mechanism that lots of hospitals use? That might be a really attractive way of dealing with things. Or, like you say, creating those communities within the hospital environment and stuff. I'd just like to, I'd like to see how they could have a better offer for us in primary care. That's the only thing, because a lot of their functions don't seem to align to what we necessarily do in primary care, and therefore makes it a bit harder for, I guess, for yourself and myself to really jump behind them in comparison to Teams.
It's difficult. We should talk about innovation in primary care IT space, because I find the ecosystem interesting, and we're so dependent on the big clinical systems that we use, and the appetite to use something in addition to those is often limited. So, and often you find they belatedly incorporate features that others innovate. But interesting. So going forwards from here, Gandhi, so are you going to make any immediate changes to your messaging behaviors? What are you going to do? We've reflected. What's your action, if
So
any?
I have joined Signal since all this happened. That's partly because a couple of the groups that I was part of made a break for using Signal instead of using WhatsApp. And I was keen to still be a part of the information being shared within that group. And increasingly, I'm seeing more and more people jump on Signal. So Signal kind of tells you when other people have started using it as well, which is interesting. So will I continue to use Signal? We'll see. It's still in the early stages of that, but I can definitely see that being an option. And I think it's more the people helping us do that information, if they were to jump, then that would make the process a lot easier, because having to create that network effect again, like you said, that's probably the biggest challenge. Would I shift it towards Teams actually for work? Probably. I think that's what's going to end up happening, because at least I'm more confident about the security and compartmentalizing it as well. So work stuff is on Teams, non-work stuff is on my home WhatsApp, and I'm still happy to talk to my family on stuff on WhatsApp, because to be honest, I'm not going to get away from that.
Yeah, I think so. I'm in a similar position to yourself, Gandhi. So I think with work-related stuff, I think I'd really like to see a move to Teams, and I think that will probably happen. There's something about the kind of block contract with the NHS that I think provides some assurance of Microsoft's behavior around the data that's shared within those NHS Teams accounts, that I think is really protective. So for work, I'd like to see a shift to Teams, and I think that's something that can and will happen. I think WhatsApp has such a huge network effect for the rest of my life that I'm not sure I'll be able to get away from it. But I think I will download Signal and start to kind of explore some of the options out there. And everybody communicated with. Do you remember? Was it MSN Messenger? People used to use, revealing our age probably. Where's that now? Well, it's morphed into MS Teams and it's fairly popular probably, but new entrants came along and ate its lunch, at least for a while.
Exactly.
So probably not insurmountable, I think.
So it'd be interesting to know what our EGP learners think about this, and let us know in the comments which platform you think you'll be using moving forward, now that you've kind of heard our views and stuff, and also seen some of the information and things. If you do want to check out those links, feel free to do so. They are down in the show notes below. So feel free to check out those. And definitely, like I said, let us know in the comments. If you have found this episode useful, definitely leave us a like to let us know that you've enjoyed this content. Subscribe it as well. It'd be appreciative if you did. And as always, EGP Learning is here to help save you and your patients time by taking enhancing primary care and learning. And we will catch you in the next episode.